This on? Yes, our speaker's working. Hey, welcome to, wow, did they just say that out loud? It's the webinar this quarter from the Metiss Group. And of course, John and Cindy Gave here. We're going to wait till we get everybody in and make sure everybody's situated.
Yep, starting to
Give me a feel for when the onslaught of attendees.
Yeah, no, people are coming in now as we speak. Maybe as they're coming in, we can do a little bit of the housekeeping.
Yep. This is obviously being recorded, as we heard from that very loud speaker going off next to us. And that means anybody who has registered, whether you're able to attend or not, will receive these slides. And as a bonus this time, there will be one of the graphics that we're going to show you that's kind of be hard to see in this thing, and we're going to make it available because it tends to be very interesting. We get a lot of requests for it. So I'll point that out when we get there. Generally, these last about 30 to 40 minutes. Kind of depends on how many questions we get and how long it takes to answer them. Any of you who have questions, please put them in the Q&A part.
Yeah. One of the reasons we do this together is I'll man the questions in the chat. So feel free to use those two channels for any kind of communication, and I'll field those.
Yes. We are John and Cindy Gay from the Metiss Group. I founded the business, gosh, it's almost 29 years ago. Isn't that crazy? And started it in Metro Detroit and migrated down here about 18, 19 years ago. There's a slide later. We'll get more into that. But so I'm very lucky to be married to my business partner.
Down here is Charlotte, by the way.
Oh, yeah, Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right, we're ready. And I'm John Gave. I'm the managing partner here at the Metiss Group. I'm the guy who makes all this stuff happen, and he makes it work.
No.
You make it happen, I make it work.
Yes, I make it happen, he makes it work.
So together we work well, and we get to leverage each other's strength and kind of leverage our EQ unique abilities. So
yeah. So I'm sure as you guys read the title of this, and for those of you who don't know, I'm not demonstrating poor EQ. I was born and raised in Jersey, so I use the term guys asexually. But I'm sure you guys, when you read this title, thought, oh man, have I said that out loud, or at least thought it a zillion times. And so what's interesting is to look at emotional intelligence today, because it's really changed through the years or through the decades. In the old days, emotional intelligence was kind of a warm fuzzy, and now it is a significant cornerstone of well-functioning workplaces.
Yeah, you can't go through an airport or spend any time in public without seeing somebody demonstrating poor EQ with their phone. Whether they're using their speaker or having a conversation in an unusual spot, all that self-awareness is just an example of where you see EQ in parts of work as well as in public.
Yeah, I think so. John knows my pet peeve is usually in airports, either like 5 people strolling slowly abreast down the hallway, oblivious to people who are trying to make a plane. Or my favorite is ladies, especially, who like to be on the speakerphone in the restroom for some reason, only to God. But I think that's about the same as what happens to EQ in the parking lots of big box stores. All of a sudden, it seems like their emotional intelligence drops significantly. That's John's pet peeve place, is the parking lots.
No, we'll not call those stores out, though.
No, no, I refer to them as big box stores.
Right.
Okay.
Oh,
the making it work part includes advancing the slides. So I want to believe most of you have watched Ted Lasso, and for what it's worth, maybe after you've watched this webinar, you go back and watch any of the Ted Lasso episodes. I think there's tons of really good and really poor examples of emotional intelligence. But especially as you think of how oh my God, it's just Nate has evolved through the show. In the beginning, he was this dweeby guy with no self-confidence who was taken advantage of, but he was very sweet and was very supportive of others, but really didn't have any good self-awareness or be able to manage his emotional relations. He then changed at one point and became a very aggressive, arrogant, ruthless jerk. And in both cases, there was some poor emotional intelligence. You could say that at one point, maybe there was some overcorrection in one areas and not in others. And so think about that when we talk about balancing some subscales of emotional intelligence, because he really did go from one extreme to another, but both were very poor.
Yeah, and one of the things I liked about the show is not just the Nate character and his transformation in emotional intelligence practices, but some of the other characters as well had really fascinating emotional intelligence advantages and disadvantages. And it's interesting to see how the writers uh, developed those characters and
Really exposed that.
integrated that. Yeah.
So I promised you there'd be a slide a little bit about us, the Metiss Group. Again, as I said, I founded the business in Metro Detroit almost 29 years ago, and then 10 years later expanded into the Charlotte, North Carolina area. We really focus in a couple of areas. One is really in selection, which we call that hiring process coach, the top of the Leadership Academy. And the rest is about accelerating the performance of direct reports, which really comes from leadership acceleration, emotional intelligence, strategic leadership, and even success process, all the other items in Leadership Academy. If you've really hired the superstars, you've got the right people in the right seats, then getting extraordinary performance out of them is more a reflection of the leadership than it is the individual if you've hired correctly. So they both kind of go hand in glove. We have half of our team still in Metro Detroit, the other half here in the Charlotte, North Carolina area, and we continue to expand.
Yeah, and what we're going to focus on today is going to be the emotional intelligence part of our Leadership Academy. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the model. We talked a little bit about it in the past. So one of the things we're going to do differently in this particular conversation is we're actually going to talk about specific EQ situations in the workplace that we have observed in previous lives and roles or seen at our clients, and share the situation and talk a little bit about the EQ that was at play and how it may be developed or leveraged in many cases.
So when you think about emotional intelligence, most of the business thought leaders in this space have talked about understanding yourself, which is about self-awareness and self-regulation, and understanding others, which is about empathy and communication. But it really starts with self. If you don't understand how you yourself are coming off, that's a big deal. And when it comes to communication, you guys may remember this from some of our other webinars, only 7% of our communication actually happens from the words we choose. 58% actually comes from mannerisms and eye contact and body language. And 35% is actually coming from the tone of voice, the articulation, the pace of the voice, the volume of the voice. And so all of those things come into play, and many people lose sight of those things. I did know one young lady who had the most infectious smile. She could light up a room just by smiling. And there was a situation when I remember her mom was present and she was more focused on what her mom was doing. And she had that face that was coming off very negatively. And it wasn't until somebody whispered something in her ear and she lit up again. But she was completely unaware of the communication she was giving off when she wasn't concentrating on how she was being perceived. To some extent, we're a little lucky now with all of the Zoom calls we're on. We get to face ourselves all the time and see exactly what we're looking like. We actually recommend a lot of people who still use general phone calls to have a mirror in front of them to be reminded about how they're coming off.
Yeah, one thing that we've learned as we're digging more and more into emotional intelligence is the EQ abbreviation isn't always understood. So we typically use emotional intelligence and EQ interchangeably.
Right.
Sometimes in the marketplace, some people will refer to EQ or emotional intelligence as EI. But most places you'll see EQ and emotional intelligence used interchangeably. Both of them are referring to the understanding of oneself and the understanding of others and how those intelligences are applied.
So when we think about how it plays out in the workplace, it again, It's not really just the warm, fuzzy stuff, but it comes through in communication. It comes through in the words we choose, the context we choose to give people. You heard us say time and time again, there's a difference between um, judging ourselves by our intention and judging others by their behaviors. And nobody can understand what our intentions are if we don't communicate that clearly. So how EQ, how your emotional intelligence is perceived by others, much of the time has a lot to do with that context that we're giving them or not. How it impacts decision making. I've heard for many years people saying, just take all the emotions out of it when you're making a business decision, which isn't really fair because if your own emotions aren't bought into the decision you're making, procrastination comes into play, dragging your feet through things, how you roll it out won't sound confident, won't sound genuine, but also putting into play the emotional impact on others. If there were layoffs and things like this, and you're not thinking about the emotional impact on others, that certainly could impact your decision making or the means by which you implement it. Uh,
Yeah, most recently, we've all had an opportunity to experience EQ in the workplace over the election, and it doesn't really matter where you were in the whole process, but seeing how others were demonstrating self-regulation and how others may have been demonstrating understanding others, that whole self-awareness and awareness of others in that particular emotional situation was a real life example of how we needed to demonstrate EQ in the workplace just recently.
yeah, and so it's not really just about conflict resolution, but conflict avoidance. That can play a lot into it. Of course, leadership and then the ability to adapt to different things. If you can't read a situation to understand that it requires a different response, then your adaptability isn't going to be very
Mhm.
strong either.
Mhm.
Uh, we have been in search for years for a really strong EQ model. There's wonderful science and great thought leaders out there, um, from Daniel Blink and Malcolm Gladwell and Izzy Justice locally.
Well, Danny Goldman
Daniel Goldman is the
the
granddaddy of them all. They're all wonderful, but we didn't really care for a lot of the assessments that we saw because most of them were self-reported. And we all know most of the self-reported stuff, people don't have the world's greatest self-awareness. So if your self-awareness is struggling, then how good are the reports going to be coming out of a self-only um, tool? So we loved the book, The EQ Edge. I strongly encourage everybody who's interested to read it. It's a nice mix of some fables mixed with science to break it down, which I loved. But they talk about this wheel that you see there. There are 5 composite scales. So we have that self-perception, self-expression, and interpersonal skills, which are the standard. The other thing that we love specifically about the EQI, which is the name of this tool, or the EQ 360, is that it includes decision making and stress management. And we all know that in the workplace right now is tremendously important. And then for each of those 5 composite scales, there are 3 subscales. We'll get into that a little bit more as we get into the real life scenarios. But the fact that it draws it specifically into the business situation is pretty incredible. One of the things that I found fascinating, our colleague who turned us on to this works primarily with government contracts, and all the U.S. Marshals are using this now. Anybody who's in state and federal law enforcement is part of the program with her. And so it's really not just for those people in sales or customer service anymore.
What's fascinating about a 360 approach is getting the data from the different types of observers and comparing it to what the person's self-reported scores are. And it's fascinating how different those groups of people's perception of somebody's emotional intelligence is. Many times the participant has an inflated view of themselves. And in some cases, they have an overinflated view of themselves relative to their peers or their direct reports or their friends or family or whatever other groups are that are a part of their 360. So whatever instrument one would pursue, we strongly suggest you have some sort of 360 view of the participants' emotional intelligence.
The thing that's really cool about this particular 360 is the emotional intelligence, and you can include your boss, your peers, your direct reports, even friends and family or other, if you're in some other business networking group or what have you. And you get to select who is going to give you the feedback. So generally, those people who are filling it out are people who really care about you and are excited about you on this journey, and they're willing to give you information out of a care perspective. It's not necessarily a performance 360 in the workplace. It's really about this personal reflection and development. And to John's point, we've worked with a few young people who probably were told all their lives, you're really bad at dealing with people. You should just go into engineering because, you're bad. And when they got the information back from the 360, their scores were all consistently lower than everybody else. And so that was pretty amazing for them to get that information that they were much better than they thought. And boy, what a difference that made for them. We also understand that there are some folks who overinflate and they get a dose of reality that way by getting some of that feedback. One gentleman that we worked with scored much better in the workplace, and his family scored him really low. And what he realized was, upon conversation with his coach, is that his kids had grown up and they were now late teens, early 20s. And the type of parenting they needed from him was very different than when they were young tots and he could just order them around or say no or yes. And so it was quite an enlightenment for him to realize, oh my gosh, I need to look at different parenting skills. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, one of the other reasons we like this particular model is the way in which the various intelligences are broken apart allows for focused development. So in many other models where you're just looking at self-awareness and self-regulation and empathy and understanding of others, those are much more difficult to develop in a broad sense. What we like about this particular instrument is it breaks it down into, what is it, 18, 15
subscales.
15 different subscales of intelligence that you can develop or leverage. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those subscales come into play shortly. But this is a list of all the different types of emotional intelligence that is measured in this particular instrument to give you an idea of the robustness of this particular tool. And again, there are other tools out there that have similar evaluations, but this is one that we like because it breaks it down and it allows you to focus on specific areas of development.
So this is the document on the right is the one that we are going to make available to you as the bonus with the slides.
Actually, I included them both in the slides.
So good.
Yeah,
so on the document on the right, the 5 items you see on the left there are the composite scales. The one in the middle are the subscales. Now, what's interesting, if you want to super geek for a moment, once you get this, if you look at the far right column, on self-regard, as an example, there are 3 balancing scales that may pull from across the wheel from each other that need to not just be developed, but be in balance for somebody to be strong in that area. And so that's why we really like how the model really comes together, as John said, for that focused development.
Right. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to use this in the workplace with some real live scenarios. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through, I think we got maybe a half a dozen or so real life scenarios. We're going to describe what we have observed in the particular situation and then break it down a little bit based on the model and talk about what could have been done differently and what could be developed.
So this is the real life scenario. We had a client who rather proudly was explaining he had one direct report who was just always crying. He would call her into his office to talk about a project or give her a compliment or maybe some course correction, but it didn't matter. As soon as she walked in, she started crying. And he would literally reach behind him, grab the Kleenex box, throw it on the desk and say, "Let me know when you're done." So obviously that didn't have the results he was hoping for. We realized the factors that were at play was his empathy to really understand where she was coming from, his ability to value and nurture those interpersonal relationships, and to temper his assertiveness a little bit. So when it came to EQ development, if you were to invest in this, emotional expression goes a long way for even demonstrating some of that empathy, which needed to be developed. So understanding where people are coming from, but then moderating that emotional expression so you have the right emotional expression for the situation, and his ability to problem solve a little bit. As you might imagine, she cried all the harder once he put the Kleenex box out. So he didn't quite get the results he was hoping for.
Yeah, and what we found about this particular example is the leader who thought he was being generous by handing this box of tissue to this weeping direct report was actually not demonstrating any empathy at all, and had very, very poor understanding of emotional expression. And instead of sort of understanding where this direct report was coming from and empathizing with her sadness, he basically had this cold, harsh, you know, use a tissue and let me know when you're done type of approach that was not very productive.
No, and it's, clearly it wasn't that she was even just sad so much as insecure, and that was how it was coming out in emotions.
Right. So when we would work with somebody like that, first of all, we need to make sure that they are aware of how they acted. In this case, they lacked empathy and their interpersonal skills, and their assertiveness was out of control. We need to make sure they understood that, and then could work on some balancing emotional intelligences to deal with situations like that. So here's another one.
We were very fortunate to work with a CEO of a very successful business inside a large holding company. And the holding company as a whole was starting to suffer. And because this one was so successful, it was the one that could be sold off for the most amount of money. He called me up and he said that he wanted to make sure that in going through the due diligence and going through the sale, that they could retain as many of the amazing employees as they had accumulated through the years. And they have hundreds of employees. His ability to problem solve, to understand what it was going to take to actually retain all of those people. Because normally in those situations, even if you're trying to keep it quiet, in the absence of information, people will make stuff up, and the stuff they make up will blow your minds. So if all of a sudden there's a lot of closed door meetings, or all the top executives are off site for too many days in a row, rumors start. And so his ability to understand that, his ability to empathize with how they felt from an insecurity perspective, his ability to manage one-on-one interpersonal skills, especially with the leadership team, and to maintain optimism was truly extraordinary. What was really amazing is it probably took them about 14 months from the time he called me. I don't know how much time he spent before that to the time it sold. And in that entire time, they lost one employee. And the key to this is, in the absence of the way he managed the communications and kept people in the loop with what he was legally able to share, really had a huge impact, because normally your best employees leave first because they can get whatever jobs they want if they're outstanding employees. So retaining them was critical to maintain the value of the organization. So he was able, the supporting strengths he was able to really leverage with those interpersonal skills, his flexibility. And the social responsibility isn't just a responsibility for society at large, it's for your own tribe, your own group of people with whom, your community with whom you interact.
Yeah, what's important about this particular situation is letting the participant understand what their strengths are in emotional intelligence, so that they can continue to leverage them. So what is great about it, this type of instrument, is not only does it help you develop some of your blind spots or your weaknesses, but it also helps you understand where you're strong at, so that you can continue to maximize and leverage them in the workplace. And in this particular example, the CEO was really, really good at his interpersonal relationships and social responsibilities. So here's another one.
Okay, This dates back to one of my first earliest jobs, and I was the HR generalist. I was responsible for onboarding people who were recruited. And we had an obnoxious recruiter who was constantly doing things that made us insane. And one day I was onboarding someone who was told we had vision insurance that we didn't offer, by the way. And we had close to 1,000 employees. So it wasn't like something I could make up on the fly. And I was a little startled. So I came out of that meeting and I went into the recruiter's office and I said, why would you tell somebody we had a benefit that doesn't really exist? And he said, because he really needed it. His wife or his kid or something has major vision issues. So he really needed it. I'm like, but we don't have it. And he said, well, they're here now. So clearly, emotional intelligence deficient. He completely lacked the ability to empathize with where somebody else was coming from and how they were going to feel when they found that poor man felt betrayed, that he was lied to, actually lied to in the hiring process. This particular recruiter's ability to rationally problem solve and look for other solutions was ridiculous. And his social responsibility, caring for the people in the organization, was completely non existent. So, if someone other than me was willing to work with this idiot on developing his emotional intelligence, in problem solving, there are two components that I really like. One is reality testing, right? So let's test what kinds of reality things are true and how does this fit within that? And impulse control. His impulse was just to promise whatever he could and then deal with the fallout later. So impulse control is really your ability to step back, size things up, and then choose. And obviously that's going to impact your decision making because you're able to consider alternate solutions. And obviously interpersonal relationships needed to be significantly developed.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges in this particular example is the poor EQ demonstrated by this recruiter not only impacted the new hire, but impacted the hiring manager in the HR group who
And the HR person.
had to go back and clean it up. So this person's lack of awareness of others came into play all the way around in that particular situation.
Mhm.
It's a fun one.
This is probably one of my favorite ones. And I don't know, one of our team members, we were preparing for this, and we shared this story, and I don't know that she ever heard about this, but I had the distinct privilege of working with her dad when I was very early in my career. In fact, it was the same company with the idiot recruiter. And he was actually the business owner for one entire division that he sold to this other company. And when I came on board, I remember him being shocked. I was the first HR person he got to work with. He said before that he had a recruiter, and he walked into my office the first day and he said, "What am I supposed to do with you? You're in charge of HR." And so we had a good conversation with it. But Thanksgiving rolled around and he said, "So just so you know, bring some warm clothes the week before Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving, because we pull up a big refrigerated tractor trailer. You and I jump in and we hand out turkeys to everybody." I'm like, "We're not doing that." Because people complained if they had a small family, they got a smaller turkey, and the bigger families got a bigger turkey, and there was all of this nonsense. So I said, let's just give them a grocery store gift card, and then they all get the same amount, and they could spend it on whatever they wanted. So that worked out better, and I didn't freeze. But that day, because we were coming up to the holidays, we had told everybody, come in for your gift card, and you'll also get your check early for the holidays. And this one young woman with her little toddler walked in, and she was a brand new employee. And she came in, we gave her her gift card, and she said, "I was looking to pick up my check too." And we said, "Well, you just started last week." So she wasn't due to get a check actually for another 2 weeks. And she just stared at us. And we said, "I'm sorry that somebody didn't explain that to you, but this is the pattern of the checks and whatever." And she's like, that's okay. And she kind of backed out and she barely got out the door. And Ron looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, she was banking on that check to get her through. She needs to put food on the table." And that's when I found out he had a secret compartment in his wallet And he pulled out $100 bill and he said, "Here, go run her down and give this to her." And I said, "Wait, shouldn't we type something up and have her sign something so that she pays you back?" And he said, "No, she just needs to put food on the table. Get out and go get her before she gets in her car." And so I ran out and I gave her the $100. And of course, she was incredibly grateful. But his ability to problem solve the situation, his empathy, first of all, was off the charts. He could read the situation incredibly well. His caring, his social responsibility for his peeps was amazing, but his ability to problem solve was strong too. In the subscales, the EQ strengths that came out obviously were that problem solving, which was strong. The flexibility was huge. If I had been left there on my own at 22 years old, I would have probably said, "Sorry, the checks aren't coming. I can try to get you something in, next week as a draw against it, but otherwise I was up the creek." So his flexibility was incredible, and his interpersonal skills. It's funny because he really wanted to come off as this tough guy, and he was true, and an enraged, tough bear and stuff, and he was really more of a teddy bear, and he really, really cared about all of his people.
And one of the reasons we have the emotional intelligence in our leadership academy is so those leaders, given those types of situations, can understand not only the impact that they had on that particular employee, but think about the impact they had on that team member's family, and how that leader, by being able to demonstrate their emotional intelligence and take care of that team member on the fly, not only made an impact for them during a holiday, but for their whole family. And that's really the power of the emotional intelligence.
And not only that, but think about it, this is almost 40 years ago. Don't you all do the math? But I'm still telling the Ron story. So think about all the people she told. Think of all the people that she recommended to the organization that told the stories over and over again. How many other people would have done that? It was pretty amazing.
All right, I think we got time for one more here.
The t-shirt size on the application. One of our team members worked in an organization whose owner insisted that the t-shirt size be on the application. For whatever reason, this particular owner decided that it gave them an idea if somebody was significantly overweight, and they inaccurately drew the conclusion that if somebody were too big, they would be lazy, they would be slothful, they would not be able to be as productive. And so they intentionally used that as a discrimination tool. That would have been illegal in the state of Michigan, where you cannot discriminate on the basis of height or weight. But it's just wrong in so many other ways. They lack the social responsibility. They clearly lacked reality testing. And their problem solving ability. They were making decisions without having facts. There is no correlation between someone's size and their productivity. And then the areas that would need to have been developed would have been obviously empathy, their own emotional self-awareness, and their interpersonal skills.
What was funny about this particular situation is not only did the owner insist that the t-shirt size be on the application, but when it was brought up by other team members that it might not be a good practice to do, he doubled down and was insistent that they continued to do that.
Ironically, he's not small.
Is that right? All right, real quick, want to do this. I think this is the last one we have up on our list here.
Team members worked someplace else, not here, and they had a supervisor who would, when they would bring great ideas forward, the supervisor would poo-poo them, bash them down, say it was ridiculous, blah, 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 and shortly thereafter, introduce it as their own fantastic idea. So you can imagine the things that were at play here from an emotional intelligence perspective.
Whoop. I had a question. I was reading through.
We're looking at assertiveness. They were very assertive. The independence is because they were really they didn't think they needed anybody else. So they were dismissive of others, and their inability to understand the impact that they were having on others. At the very least, the odds of other people making really good suggestions in the future, if they knew this supervisor were a credit thief, would significantly go down. So if this person were to try to develop their emotional intelligence, interpersonal relationships was going to have to be key. They were going to have to start understanding their direct reports, what was important to them, what they valued. They needed to manage their stress. Clearly, they were coming off as incredibly insecure, which is a huge factor in stress tolerance and their emotional self-awareness, feeling threatened by their own direct reports, great ideas, and then stealing those is just a sad situation for that supervisor.
Yeah, once again, the value of emotional intelligence training for leaders is to help them understand their their emotional weaknesses so that they aren't trying to make up for it in other ways.
As we mentioned earlier, there's some great thought leaders in this space. So you have Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence and Emotional Intelligence 2.0. Obviously, the EQ Edge we love. And EQI is the certifications we have here. The EQI 2.0 is the self-reported on which the 360 is based. And by 360, we're meaning 360-degree view of how you're perceived by others. And there are different things you can do relative to workshops. There's some practicing you can do. In the absence of doing any assessments, one of the other exercises I believe that can be incredibly useful is the stop, start, continue exercise. So if you want to bring in a direct report and say to them, hey, warn them in advance what you're asking for and then call the meeting. I'd like to know 2 things you'd really like me to start doing, 2 things you'd like me to stop doing, 2 things you'd like me to continue doing. And then don't defend or whatever. You just say thank you for the feedback because I'm collecting information and I'm going to process it. But in the absence of having a good tool, that can get you a little good start.
Yeah, one of the things that we're finding as people go through the program and learn about EQ is trying to self-reflect and assess what that means to them. And it's one thing to learn about empathy. It's another thing to understand what that means in your world or internally for you. How empathetic are you? And what can you do to develop your understanding of others, or what can you do to increase your self-awareness around all these different EQ practices. A couple of questions. You can just drop them in the chat there. I have a couple here that came through. We talked about EQ in the workplace and those people who might want to look. Who is it not for? What type of people might it not be for?
It's not for those people who are really proud of how obnoxious they are. There are some people, like the Kleenex guy, who believes that his sarcasm brings a dose of reality, and he has no intention of changing and believes the rest of the world should adapt to him.
Yeah. That if you don't want to change, then why bother? Which gets us another question is, what does it cost? What would one expect if they were going to embark on an EQ journey to invest?
Depending on the length of the coaching, it's anywhere from 3,300 to 7,000 through us anyway. And some of that depends on the length of the coaching. So for most people, the first month when you're getting debriefed on all of the scores and you're processing it, it truly is being fed through the fire hose and requires a lot of self-reflection for the first month or so. The second month you're meeting with your coach, kind of laying out what the plan is, and by the third, you're putting some specific measurables and practices in that you want to do, and that's a great start. But beyond that, some folks really like access to an additional coach for accountability as well as additional resources.
And another one we got out here is how quickly or how long does it take to develop? The guy with the Kleenex box, how long might it take for him to realize
Well,
that
I think he falls in the who's it not for. But, it's of course, everybody hates the answer. It depends. But they say the first sign of improvement is accepting who you are, is admitting it. And I would say that for the most part, it takes a matter of time to, again, absorb, reflect, choose what you really want to work on, the first time you try to do something differently, you're typically not great with it, and then do some iterations until you get better with it. The exception to that is those young people that we were working with who probably were told their lives, you should go into engineering because you suck at people, and they were actually pretty good. When they got their immediate feedback, I heard back from the COO right after their first month of coaching, even before that, and they had to do a small group presentation. They said you should have seen their confidence level go up in how they were presenting to just their small group. And so in his case, he saw it essentially immediately. So a lot, and it also depends on how determined the participant is on improving those things and how quickly they want to put things into practice.
I think I have time for one more, and that is when you're being trained on EQ, do you have to do it in person, or is this something that somebody can do virtually, or what's the easiest way to be trained?
Good question. In almost all cases, we are doing it all virtually. We are thinking about maybe doing um, some workshops in the future, but I'll tell you, this is the most personal information that can be shared. It requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of vulnerability, and oftentimes a one-on-one with a coach, just in a Zoom room, is a much safer environment. You can be in your own home, you can be in your car, wherever you feel safest for these conversations. And oftentimes being in a sterile workshop environment doesn't really cut it.
Yeah, I would echo that. Our coaches have found they've gotten better connection with the people they're coaching virtually rather than being in person. People tend to be a little bit more vulnerable on Zoom. It's kind of hard to imagine, but I guess that's just the way we're wired. That as you're pursuing your emotional understandings, it is important to get vulnerable, and in many cases, that's easier for people to do remotely.
I think the other part of that is that because it's remote and we have clients all over, mostly the US, they don't have to worry about running into their coach who knows their deepest secrets at the grocery store. Right? It's just on a Zoom, and they're unlikely to run into them elsewhere. And I think that gives them a sense of confidence and comfort in sharing and being honest.
So we'll wrap. We will make sure that everyone who has signed up and everyone who has attended will receive the slides that you can refer back to, as well as a recording. And also within the slide package is going to be the models that we're referring to give you an understanding of the detail that you want as you're looking at EQ development.
We're also toying with the idea of maybe doing a follow-up to this. So if any of you would like to share your own personal EQ stories, either good examples or really lousy examples, we get a big kick out of the lousy ones. We would love to potentially include them in our next one. So thanks all for participating. We look forward to hearing some of your comments.
All right.